Our Thanksgiving is full, maybe next year, Dad messaged. I just said, no worries. They had no idea I'd bought a $5 million ranch in Montana. I ended up feeding 200 strangers that day. When the photo showed up on Facebook, they absolutely lost it. Can you imagine getting a text message from your own father? Just 8 cold words, telling you there's no room for you at the Thanksgiving table? My heart didn't just break that morning. It hardened, turning a quiet ache into a roaring fire of determination. The initial blow: I'm Amelia Hart, 32, living in Seattle. That Thanksgiving morning my coffee was still steaming in my hand, but a chill ran right through me. My phone buzzed. It was Dad. The screen glowed with those words. Thanksgiving's full. Maybe next year. No emoji, no explanation, just that brutal finality. I stared at them until my coffee went stone cold. They looked so innocent on the surface, practical even. But I recognized the familiar, icy sting behind them, a coldness that had followed me my entire life. My reply was 2 words, perfectly polite, perfectly neutral. No worries. I pressed send, my thumb hovering, almost begging for a follow-up. Something like, we'll squeeze you in. Or drop by later. But nothing came. The silence that followed was deafening, louder than any argument we'd ever had. Outside, Seattle was already humming with holiday cheer. Car horns softened by drizzle, shop windows overflowing with cinnamon pies and paper turkeys. Every corner smelled of roasted chestnuts in anticipation. But in my apartment, just the hum of the refrigerator and the crushing weight of an empty chair. I could almost hear the laughter already rising from my parents' house in Portland, the scrape of serving spoons, the clinking of glasses when my sister Lena walked in with her husband and their twin boys. The perfect family tableau. My parents at the head of the table, Mom's voice. So thankful for all of us being together. All of them, that is, except me. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. Instead, something inside me settled into a strange, unsettling calm. Maybe it's because, without realizing it, I'd been preparing for this moment for years. There's only so many times you can be told, maybe next year, before you finally decide, no, this year is mine. A secret empire. I set my cup down, walked to the corkboard above my desk, and pinned up a printed invoice that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. It was the closing paper for a ranch in White Valley, Montana. 260 acres of open land, cedar cabins, and a kitchen big enough to host a village. The number at the bottom still made my stomach clench. $5 million. But it wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented: freedom. Proof that I could build something from absolutely nothing. I hadn't told my parents, of course. To them, I was still Amelia, the too busy daughter, always chasing projects, never home long enough to fit into their carefully curated picture. They had no idea that the same silence they'd given me had become the fuel that built an empire in logistics tech. That every proud word spoken about Lena had pushed me to work one more sleepless night until my company finally stood strong on its own 2 feet. And they certainly didn't know that this Thanksgiving, I wasn't planning to eat takeout noodles alone in front of the TV. Oh no, I had something else in mind. Something bigger, warmer, louder. Building my own table this year. I would cook for people who didn't have anyone. For the drivers sleeping in their trucks on frozen highways, the nurses pulling double shifts, the veterans living in trailers beyond the town's edge. I would open the ranch gates wide and let anyone who needed a place to belong walk right through. 200 seats, 200 plates, 200 chances to turn loneliness into light. Maybe it was foolish, maybe even impulsive, but I'd spent too many holidays watching from the outside. I desperately wanted to know what it felt like to create my own table instead of begging for a chair at someone else's. I pictured it already. Long wooden tables under strings of golden lights. The smell of roasted turkey drifting into the snowy air. Strangers clinking mugs of cider like old friends. No rehearsed prayers. No polite small talk about careers or mortgages. Just people grateful to have a warm meal and to be seen. That image burned bright enough to melt the heaviness sitting in my chest. For the first time, the idea of being excluded didn't hurt. Felt like permission. Permission to rewrite the script. So I texted my assistant a short message. Call the sheriff's office in White Valley. Ask about local shelters or anyone who needs a meal tomorrow. Then another. Find 10 more ovens. Overnight delivery if needed. Replies came within minutes. The plan was in motion. The ache that had filled me all morning shifted into sharp focus, into purpose. Maybe that's what Thanksgiving was meant to be all along. Not about who invited you, but about who you decided to feed. I looked back at my father's message one last time before turning off my phone. Thanksgiving's full. Maybe he was right. His table was full. But mine? Mine was just beginning to be set. A childhood on the sidelines. Have you ever been told, gently but firmly, that there's no room for you? That maybe next year, maybe another time, maybe somewhere else? If you have, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because tonight, in the middle of all these full tables, I need to know I'm not the only one who decided to build her own. When I think back, it's almost funny how every memory of Thanksgiving in our house revolved around one thing. The table. The Hart family table was the centerpiece of every photograph, every celebration, every illusion of unity we tried to preserve. But what those photos never showed was the smaller, foldable table in the corner. That's where I sat. My chair was never quite steady, one leg shorter than the rest, covered with a leftover tablecloth that didn't quite match the rest of the room. At the time I told myself it was fine. The real table was crowded with adults, with Lena, my older sister, at the head of every conversation. I was just the quiet one who didn't mind helping in the kitchen. I learned early that in our family, attention was a scarce resource, and it always flowed in one direction. Toward Lena, the golden child. She was sunshine bottled into human form, at least in my parents' eyes. Straight A's, debate captain, homecoming queen, everything. When my father carved the turkey, he'd raise his glass and say something like, "We're so thankful for how hard Lena works, for the bright future ahead of her." Everyone would clap, my mother's eyes glistening with pride. Someone would inevitably ask Lena about her college plans or her law internships. Then they'd turn back to their plates, satisfied that gratitude had been properly expressed. No one ever asked what I was thankful for or what I'd been working on. I was usually still in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishes, pretending the clatter was enough company. I can still remember one year I was 14. That was the year I decided to bake my first pumpkin pie from scratch. I spent hours measuring spices, rolling the dough, trying to make the crust absolutely perfect. The smell filled the whole kitchen, warm and sweet, and for once I felt proud. I carried it to the counter, careful not to drop it, waiting for my mother to turn around. When she did, she smiled faintly, then said, "Maybe we'll let Aunt Margaret taste that one first, honey. You know, just to be safe. Sometimes your recipes can be a little off." She didn't mean it cruelly. She said it the way people comment about the weather, casually, carelessly. But it landed like a stone in my chest. Everyone laughed softly, and the moment dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Later, I saw the pie sitting half-eaten at the edge of the dessert spread. No one remembered who had made it. That's how it always went. Every holiday blurred into a pattern of almost being seen, almost being praised, almost belonging. When I brought home a science fair ribbon, my father patted my shoulder and said, "That's nice, Amelia. You've always been so practical." The next day, Lena announced she'd been invited to a student leadership conference, and the whole family threw a dinner in her honor. I helped hang the gold banners that spelled "So proud of you," pretending I didn't notice the irony. Christmas wasn't any different. I was the one who wrapped everyone's gifts and wrote their names in neat cursive on the tags, only to find that somehow there was always one missing under the tree, mine. "Oh, I thought Dad was getting you something," my mother would say, and Dad would chuckle. "We'll make it up next year." It became our family joke. Next year. Always next year. The cruelest part wasn't the neglect itself. It was how normal it felt. My parents weren't monsters. They hugged me. They asked about school. They said they loved me. But love, when divided unevenly, can still leave one side starving. Every time they looked at Lena, there was pride and adoration in their eyes. When they looked at me, there was politeness. Warm enough to pass, cold enough to burn. By the time I reached high school, I had learned the choreography of invisibility. I would clear plates before being asked, laugh on cue, fill the silences with small talk no one remembered. If guests complimented the table setting or the dessert, my mother would smile and say, "Lena helped pick out the colors." She never mentioned that I'd ironed the tablecloth, arranged the flowers, or stayed up late scrubbing stains from the silverware. It wasn't malicious. It was simply the hierarchy of attention that ruled our home. I used to think it was my fault, that maybe if I were louder, funnier, more impressive, I'd finally earn a place at the main table. But every attempt backfired. One Thanksgiving, I tried to join the adult conversation, sharing that I'd been accepted into an advanced computer science program at school. My father smiled vaguely, already looking toward Lena. "That's nice, honey," he said. "But have you heard? Lena's been nominated for student council president." The conversation instantly turned, and my words hung in the air, unfinished, unwanted. I excused myself to check on the pies. Somewhere along the way I stopped trying. I built a world of my own, a quiet one. In the garage or the attic, wherever I could tinker without judgment. I liked machines because they were honest. They didn't play favorites. If something didn't work, you could fix it. If a wire broke, you could solder it back together. People weren't like that. Family wasn't like that. The older I got, the more invisible I became. When Lena graduated from college, there was a banner across the front porch, a catered dinner, a slideshow of childhood photos set to sentimental music. When I graduated, my mother posted a single picture on Facebook, a blurry snapshot with the caption, "So proud of both my girls." I remember staring at that word, both, wondering why it still felt like a consolation prize. The turning point. Stanford. Looking back now, I realized those years weren't just filled with neglect. They were rehearsals. Every forgotten pie, every empty seat, every maybe next year was teaching me something. How to survive without applause. How to build quietly. How to turn pain into fuel. That's why when my father's message came that morning, "Thanksgiving's full, maybe next year," I didn't crumble. I'd been preparing for that sentence my entire life. It was just the latest verse in a story I already knew by heart. What they didn't know was that while they'd spent years deciding who deserved a seat, I had spent those same years learning how to build my own table. And this time, no one was going to push me to the corner. When I was 17, I thought I had finally done something that would make them truly proud. It was springtime, the air still cold enough to bite, and I remember running home from the mailbox with the envelope pressed to my chest. The logo was unmistakable. Stanford University. The kind of name that silences rooms. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly tore the letter in half as I opened it. "Congratulations. You've been awarded a full scholarship." I reread the words again and again, not out of disbelief, but because I wanted to memorize the feeling, the heartbeat of being seen, even if it was just by a piece of paper. For a few minutes, I let myself imagine the scene that would follow. My parents beaming, my father calling relatives to brag, my mother, maybe even crying a little, saying she always knew I could do it. I walked into the living room, the letter trembling in my hands, ready to hand them my proof that I was worth noticing. My father was in his recliner, reading the evening paper. My mother was folding napkins for yet another dinner Lena was hosting for her debate friends. I stood there for a moment waiting for someone to look up. Dad, I said finally, my voice a little shaky. I got in. Full scholarship. Stanford. I waited for the sound, the gasp, the applause, the words every child waits their whole life to hear. I'm proud of you. Instead, my father lowered the paper halfway and frowned slightly, as if I had interrupted a thought. Stanford? That's in California, isn't it? He said it not unkindly but distantly. That's so far away, Amelia. Are you sure you want to go that far? It's expensive to live out there, even with a scholarship. Maybe you should look at something closer like Portland State. Lena's already planning to stay nearby. It'll be easier for family. The word family stung more than I could bear. I wanted to tell him that this, my acceptance letter, my achievement, was supposed to be about family, about representing us, about showing that I was more than just the quiet shadow behind his perfect daughter. But the words died in my throat. My mother didn't even pause her folding. Your father's right, honey. Being close to home means we can help you more. Plus, holidays will be easier. You know how hard it is to get everyone together. She looked at me and smiled softly, the kind of smile that was supposed to feel warm, but instead felt like being gently erased. In the doorway behind them, Lena appeared, her hair tied in a perfect ponytail, holding a tray of lemonade. What's going on? She asked, eyes glinting with curiosity. My mother turned toward her immediately. Your sister got accepted to Stanford, she said, but she's thinking about staying closer to home. Isn't that nice? Lena's eyebrows lifted, and for a moment I thought she'd say something kind, something sisterly. Instead, she shrugged and said, yeah, that's probably smarter. College isn't all it's cracked up to be if you're far away from everyone. She turned back into the kitchen, and that was that. My triumph flattened into an afterthought. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the acceptance letter resting on my chest like a weight instead of a victory. I could hear Lena laughing with her friends downstairs, her voice bright, easy, beloved. I wondered what it felt like to walk into a room and have everyone light up just because you were there. I'd never known that feeling. All I'd ever known was working twice as hard for half the applause. And even then, sometimes not even that. The next morning I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it inside my desk drawer. I didn't mention it again. A few days later my father casually told a neighbor, Lena's looking at law schools already. She'll probably make partner one day. I was standing right there, and when the neighbor asked, what about Amelia? My father smiled. Oh, she's still deciding. She's the quiet one. I remember nodding, pretending to agree, pretending it didn't cut deep. But something in me cracked open that day. It was the first time I truly understood that their approval wasn't coming. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because it was never about merit to begin with. In our family, love was not a language you could learn through effort. It was inherited by birth order and reinforced by habit. Lena had been chosen long before either of us had a chance to prove who we were. That realization hurt in a way that made the world sharper, colder. But it also gave me clarity. If I couldn't earn their pride, I would stop trying. In the months that followed, I became a ghost in my own house. I worked double shifts at a local cafe after school, saved every dollar, and filled out the housing paperwork for Stanford without telling anyone. I told my parents I was working on a summer project. In truth, I was preparing to leave. On the morning of my graduation, while Lena was busy rehearsing her valedictorian speech, I walked quietly to the mailbox and sent my confirmation deposit. It felt like signing a treaty with myself, an agreement that from now on, I would no longer beg for space at their table. I would build something of my own no matter how long it took. When I left for California that August, no one came to see me off. My father said he had a client meeting, and my mother hugged me quickly at the door, whispering, don't forget to call, okay? Lena didn't even wake up. I carried my suitcase down the front steps alone, the morning air still heavy with mist. For a fleeting moment, I looked back at the window of our dining room. The table inside gleamed under the chandelier, perfectly set for four. My seat, as always, was empty. I didn't know it then, but that quiet departure would become the defining moment of my life. There was no grand farewell, no tearful send-off, no family photo marking the beginning of my future. Just me, a bus ticket, and a promise. I would never again measure my worth by their applause. I would find a way to feed myself with purpose, with work, with meaning, even if no one else ever said they were proud. It took years to realize that was the night I stopped being a daughter in their story and started being the author of my own. Every mile between Portland and Palo Alto was a thread cutting clean through the old narrative. I cried a little on that long ride south, but they weren't tears of loss. They were the sound of chains finally snapping. By the time the bus crossed into California, the sun breaking over the horizon, I felt something I'd never felt before. The strange, quiet relief of freedom. I had left the table, and for the first time I didn't look back. The climb to success the first few years in California stripped me down to the bone. Freedom had sounded glamorous when I stepped off that bus, but in reality, it came wrapped in exhaustion and cheap instant noodles. My scholarship covered tuition but not the cost of living. And Palo Alto wasn't exactly kind to anyone without a safety net. I rented a half-basement that smelled like damp plaster and lived among boxes I couldn't afford to unpack. My bed was a sagging second-hand sofa I dragged in from a yard sale, its springs bruising my back every night. I worked shifts at a diner near campus, refilling coffee for people whose parents sent them credit cards for emergencies that didn't exist. My emergencies were constant. Unpaid bills, empty cupboards, and that gnawing question that came every time I stared at my phone. Would they even notice if I called? Still, I pushed through. Between classes, I learned to code because it felt like a language I could rely on, one that didn't lie, one that didn't play favorites. I studied logistics systems, fascinated by how one missing link could break an entire chain, how one unnoticed delay could ripple outward and cause chaos. Maybe it was my way of understanding what had happened to me, that even the smallest disconnects, repeated often enough, could break a family's structure completely. By my junior year, I was interning at a small transport startup, mapping cold chain routes for medical supplies. The pay was miserable, but the data fascinated me. How temperature, time, and distance could mean the difference between life and death for something as simple as a vaccine. After graduation, I stayed on full-time, working 12-hour days in a cramped office above a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. The company folded within a year. The investors pulled out, and the founders vanished with whatever they could salvage. I was left with 2 unpaid paychecks and a head full of spreadsheets, but also an idea. I'd seen how inefficient the system was, how much food and medicine went to waste because no one was tracking the last mile. If I could build a platform that predicted bottlenecks before they happened, one that could reroute shipments in real time, maybe I could change something. It was a ridiculous idea for someone with no money, no backing, and no last name that opened doors. But I didn't care. I had lived off scraps before. At least this time the hunger had purpose. I found 2 other dreamers. Mateo, a Cuban-American engineer who slept in his car between gigs, and June, a data analyst with a laugh like broken glass who'd been laid off from a bigger firm. We set up shop in an abandoned garage behind a laundromat. The landlord gave us a discount because he assumed we'd fail fast. For months we lived like ghosts. We coded during the day, delivered takeout at night, and held meetings in the corner of a 24-hour diner because it was the only place with Wi-Fi and free refills. I learned how to make half a sandwich last 2 meals, and how to talk investors into staying 5 more minutes before hanging up. I remember one night in particular, the heater broken, our breath fogging in the air as we stared at a glowing laptop screen, watching a live dashboard of delivery routes we'd managed to simulate. The system blinked green. Mateo hooped so loud the waitress dropped her tray. For the first time it felt real. But reality had bills. Within 6 months our savings evaporated. We were days away from defaulting on the tiny office lease when an email arrived from a regional grocery chain that serviced rural Montana and Wyoming. They were losing thousands of dollars each month due to spoiled produce on long hauls through the Rockies. They wanted to test our system. The contract was small, barely enough to cover rent and ramen, but it was a lifeline. I stayed awake for 72 hours. Straight writing the code, building tracking dashboards, and configuring alerts that'd ping drivers if a truck's temperature spiked above a threshold. When the test ended, their manager called and said, "For the first time this quarter, nothing went bad." He wired the payment that afternoon. That one pilot changed everything. Word spread through regional networks faster than we could believe. A rural hospital in Idaho reached out next, asking if we could adapt our system for organ transport between clinics. Then came a pharmaceutical distributor in Nevada. Within a year we built enough credibility to attract real clients and for the first time real employees. I was 24, running a company with 8 people. All of us still half broke but running on adrenaline. We called it Northlink Systems, a name that sounded bigger than we were. Every morning I walked into our tiny warehouse office and told myself, "You belong here." It didn't matter that I still couldn't afford health insurance or that my parents had no idea what I was doing. Each success, each shipment saved, each route optimized, felt like a private rebellion against Lena's world, where I'd always been invisible. Then the pandemic came and the world turned upside down. Supply chains collapsed. Hospitals cried out for help. And for the first time the entire country cared about logistics. Our platform, once a niche security, suddenly became a necessity. We worked around the clock, mapping distribution routes for masks, gloves, and oxygen tanks. I barely slept. The team ate cold pizza at their desks, the glow of screens reflecting in hollow eyes. But when we watched those first convoys reach hospitals on time, when nurses wrote to say, "Your system saved lives," something inside me cracked open. For the first time I felt not just useful but seen. In less than a year, Northlink expanded from 3 people in a garage to over 50 employees across 5 states. The media started calling us the nervous system of the medical supply chain. My name appeared on a Forbes 30 under 30 list, and investors began courting me instead of ignoring me. But even in the middle of all that success I never called home. I didn't send the article. I didn't tell them about the interviews or the funding round. I knew exactly what would happen if I did. My mother would say, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Lena just made senior associate?" And all the air would leave the room again. Instead I kept building. Every time a client signed a new contract, I put half my earnings into a separate account, a silent fund for something I couldn't quite name yet. By the time I turned 30, that account had grown large enough to buy the kind of freedom I used to only daydream about. One evening after another 12-hour day, I sat alone in my office with the city lights flickering through the blinds. The team had gone home, leaving behind the smell of coffee and faint laughter that still echoed in the walls. I pulled up the company dashboard, watching the blinking lines of trucks across the map. Hundreds of routes, all moving, all connected. It looked like veins pulsing with life. For a moment I thought of my family again, of the cold dinners and empty chairs, of the way silence used to fill every corner of that house. And I realized something. I had built a network out of what they'd broken. They gave me distance and I turned it into reach. A few weeks later, when the acquisition offer came from a Fortune 500 logistics firm, $120 million. I didn't celebrate with champagne or fancy dinners. I simply closed my laptop, exhaled, and drove to the edge of the city where the skyline faded into farmland. I sat there until the stars came out, tracing constellations like roots across the sky. I didn't need their applause anymore. I didn't need their table. What I needed was space, somewhere quiet enough to hold everything I'd built and everything I'd lost. A place where no one could tell me I didn't belong. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to dream of land open, unbounded land where winter snow could fall without judgment. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first night the ranch began taking shape in my mind. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was peace. And I was finally rich enough to buy it. The ranch. A new beginning. When I first drove up the narrow dirt road that wound through White Valley, Montana, I felt like I'd stepped into another world. The air was thinner here, sharper, each breath cutting clean through the noise I'd carried for years. The land unfolded endlessly, a patchwork of golden prairie brushed by wind and shadow. To the west, rows of dark pine climbed toward the snow-dusted peaks of the Bridger Range. The sky looked too big to belong to anyone, the kind of sky that made you realize how small and temporary everything else was. The ranch sat in the hollow of a valley where the morning fog gathered like silk. The house itself was a sprawling cedar-clad structure, its wide windows facing east to catch the sunrise. It had been abandoned for years when I bought it, dust thick enough to write your name in, shutters hanging crooked, the smell of wood smoke still faintly trapped in the walls. But underneath the neglect, it felt alive, waiting for someone to listen. I walked through every empty room, my hand brushing the surfaces, tracing stories that hadn't been told in a long time. The floorboards creaked under my boots as if they were whispering, "You made it home." The first room I restored was the kitchen. It was enormous, with an open hearth and a double oven built into the stone wall. I'd never had a kitchen like that, one where you could cook and still see the world outside. I replaced the cracked tiles with warm slate, hung copper pans that caught the morning light, and set a long oak table right in the center. The table was the heart of it all. I'd had it custom-made by a local craftsman, sanded smooth, the grain of the wood swirling like river currents. No head, no foot, no hierarchy. Just a continuous surface where everyone could sit as equals. And there was one rule I decided early. There would be no children's table, no corner table, no seat apart. If you came through my door, you belonged. I spent weeks bringing the place back to life. Every morning I woke before dawn, wrapped in a flannel coat and brewed coffee as frost spread across the windows. I'd step out onto the porch to watch the sun climb over the ridge, painting the fields gold. Some days wild horses passed along the fence line, their breath silver in the air. I learned the rhythm of the land, the crunch of frozen soil, the scent of cedar after rain, the silence that hummed like a heartbeat beneath everything. By late fall, the house was no longer a ruin. The walls gleamed with fresh stain, the fireplaces burned clean, and the pantry smelled of pine and flour. I'd built a cold storage room beneath the kitchen, its shelves lined with jars of pickled vegetables, sacks of flour, and enough coffee to survive a siege. When I closed the heavy door, the air turned cold and still, reminding me of the warehouses I used to map. Except this time the logistics weren't about profit. They were about preservation, about keeping something warm alive through the long winter. Outside I strung maple leaf banners across the porch beams, their deep reds and ochres fluttering in the wind. They weren't decorations. They were promises to fill this place with life again, to turn the hollow echo of solitude into something sacred. Every nail I hammered, every log I stacked, every plate I placed on that oak table was a quiet act of defiance against the years I'd spent waiting for permission to belong. I remember the first night I slept there alone. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing along the cedar walls. I sat at the table with a simple meal, bread, soup, and wine, and listened to the storm outside. There was no music, no laughter, no clinking glasses. And yet, I felt surrounded by something larger than company. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was the ghosts of every past Thanksgiving I'd missed, finally finding their way back home. I caught myself whispering into the quiet, "If they won't make a place for me, I'll build the whole table myself." From that moment, the ranch became more than property. It became a declaration. Each space held meaning. The kitchen was warmth. The porch was reflection. The long table in the center was justice. I placed a single hand-carved chair at the far end, not as a throne but as a symbol. On its back I etched the words, "For the one who felt unseen." It wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who had ever been left standing in a doorway while laughter carried on without them. I hired local carpenters to help restore the barn and turn it into a communal hall. They asked what I planned to do with so much space, and I smiled, saying only, "I'm saving it for something important." At night I'd walk through it with a lantern, the beams glowing amber above me, and I could already picture what it might become. A refuge, a place where stories could breathe again. Sometimes neighbors from the nearest town stopped by, curious about the woman who bought the old White Valley property. I'd invite them in for coffee, and we'd sit by the window talking about weather, harvests, and the long winters ahead. They told me how the valley used to host potlucks decades ago, when people still gathered just to share food and warmth. "It's been quiet since then," one elderly man said. "Too quiet." I smiled and said, "Maybe it's time we bring that back." Even there, in the rhythm of rebuilding, cutting firewood, sweeping sawdust, hearing the echo of hammer against nail, my hands, which had once typed endless strings of code, now smelled of cedar and resin. I was relearning how to create without a deadline, without anyone watching. Every day ended the same way. Me sitting on the porch steps watching the sun sink into the prairie, the air turning lavender and cold. And in those quiet hours, the ache of all the years I'd spent chasing approval began to dissolve. One evening as the first snow started to fall, I lit every lantern in the house and walked room to room. The light flickered across the wooden beams, the tables, the jars of preserves, the simple plates stacked neatly in the cupboards. The house no longer felt empty. It felt ready. It was waiting just like I had been for the right moment. That night I wrote a single sentence on the chalkboard in the kitchen. If they don't make room for you, build your own table. It wasn't bitterness that guided my hand. It was understanding. This place wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. For years I had lived small so no one would accuse me of taking up too much space. But this ranch, with its long table and open doors, was the proof that I was done apologizing for existing. When the wind howled against the windows, I stoked the fire higher and imagined the laughter that would one day fill these walls. Not polite, rehearsed laughter, but the kind that spills over and warms everyone within reach. The table gleamed in the firelight, wide enough to hold the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I'd found. In the silence, I raised my glass toward the empty chairs and whispered, "Here's to the ones who never got a seat. This table is for you." The truth comes out. Oh, that text from my father had been brief. 8 words that fit neatly inside a single line. Thanksgiving's full. Maybe next year. At first, I reread it twice, thinking there had to be a missing sentence, a follow-up, something soft to cushion the blow. But no, that was it. Cold, factual, final. The kind of message you send when you want to close a door without looking heartless. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the light flickering against the reflection of the ranch window, snow falling just beyond the glass. Then I typed back a single word. No worries. I hit send before I could feel anything, but the truth was the word settled in my chest like frost. The next morning as I sat with my coffee on the porch, watching fog curl through the pines, something in me began to question it. Full. Full of who exactly? We didn't have a massive family, even counting aunts and cousins. Thanksgiving never needed a waiting list. I tried to tell myself maybe they were keeping things small. Maybe it wasn't personal. But the ache of familiarity said otherwise. I knew the pattern too well. Simplify the guest list, leave me out, justify it later. I scrolled through my phone, hovering over my younger brother's name, Ethan. He wasn't cruel, just compliant. Always too eager to please the people who had made him their second favorite. He was the middle ground between golden and forgotten, though he leaned heavily toward Lena's light. I pressed call. He picked up after 3 rings, his voice too casual, like he'd been expecting this. "Hey sis, everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just wanted to check. Are you guys really not having Thanksgiving this year?" "Dad said it's full." Silence stretched on the line for a moment. Then came a soft sigh. "Oh, he said that." "Yeah, he did." Ethan exhaled again, slower this time. "Well, they're having it just smaller. You know, to keep it simple. Lena's family's coming up from Seattle, so it's mostly them, plus Mom's sister and a few of Lena's friends." "So it's full," I said flatly. He hesitated. "I guess that's one way to put it." For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The sound of the Montana wind filled the silence, a low howl pressing against the phone speaker. "What about Aunt June?" I asked finally. "Grandma? They're not invited either." "Dad said it'd be too crowded," Ethan admitted. He paused. "I think they're kind of letting Lena handle the guest list this year. You know how it is." I did. I'd known how it is since I was old enough to count chairs around the dining table. "Thanks for being honest," I said quietly. "And don't worry, I won't make it awkward." "Amelia," he started, but I ended the call. I didn't want pity, not even from him. I sat there for a long time, staring at the snow-covered hills beyond the fence line. The sky was pale gray, the kind that looked almost white until the sun broke through. It reminded me of all the Thanksgivings past me at the foldable table in the corner, the overflow seat, while my sister carved the turkey under the glow of chandeliers, and everyone toasted to her latest success. That ache had once hollowed me out, but now in this vast quiet land the pain didn't echo. It transformed. I realized something in that stillness. I didn't need to fight for a seat anymore. I owned the table. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top I wrote one line. Thanksgiving at White Valley Ranch. Open table. Then underneath in smaller letters, goal feed 200 people. Not guests. Not family. People. Anyone who needed warmth, food, or a reminder that they still mattered. I would fill this valley with laughter and clinking plates, with music and gratitude. I would give them the Thanksgiving I never had. The kind that saw everyone. An invitation to all. Within hours I was on the phone. The first call went to Sheriff Collins, the local officer who'd helped me once when my fence collapsed during a storm. "Sheriff," I said, "I'm hosting an open dinner at my ranch this Thanksgiving. For anyone who doesn't have a place to go. I'll cover everything: food, transport, staff, supplies." There was a pause before he said, "You're serious?" "Completely." His voice softened. "I know more people who'd need that than you can imagine. I'll spread the word." Next I called the community church in town. Pastor Ruth answered, her voice warm and worn like old leather. When I told her my plan, she went silent. For a moment I thought she was about to tell me it was impossible. But then she laughed softly. "Bless your heart, child. I've been praying for something like this. I'll announce it this Sunday." After that came the food bank, the veterans chapter, the local hospital, and even the small radio station that broadcasted through the valley. I told each of them the same thing. If you know anyone at all who needs a meal, send them here. No questions, no judgment. Just bring them. The responses were immediate and overwhelming. The hospital director offered to donate surplus produce. The food bank said they'd send volunteers. Even the truck stop diner on Route 89 called back, saying a few drivers wanted to lend their hands to set up tables. That night I sat at my oak table with the phone still buzzing beside me, a spiral of excitement and fear twisting in my chest. The snow had thickened outside, blanketing the valley in silence. I could almost hear my father's voice from years ago, telling me to keep things small, to not make a scene. But this wasn't a scene. It was a statement. If they wanted small, I would build grand. If they wanted exclusion, I would build inclusion. And if their table was full, then mine would have room for everyone else. As I blew out the candle that night, a strange peace settled over me. Not the kind born of forgiveness, but of clarity. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I was done measuring my worth against their empty chairs. This year, Thanksgiving wouldn't be about being left out. It would be about letting everyone else in. The great Thanksgiving feast the next morning. I woke before sunrise to the kind of silence that only exists in the Montana highlands. A stillness so pure it makes you afraid to breathe too loudly. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world outside the ranch blanketed in untouched white. But inside, the day was already stirring. My plan was no longer an idea scribbled in a notebook. It was happening, and it was happening now. By 6 a.m., the kitchen lights blazed like the heart of a ship. The sound of pots clanging, knives slicing, and laughter bouncing off the cedar walls filled the air. I'd expected maybe a handful of volunteers, but by dawn, more than 20 people had arrived. There was Margaret, the retired chef from Bozeman who used to cater mountain weddings, now rolling out pie crusts with a steady hand. Tom, a local rancher whose cattle grazed 2 valleys over, came with his teenage sons and a pickup truck full of firewood and potatoes. Elena, a nursing student, showed up straight from her night shift, still in scrubs, her hair tied up, eyes tired but glowing. Couldn't miss this, she said simply as she grabbed an apron. We divided the work like an orchestra tuning before a symphony. Margaret and I took charge of the main courses. 8 turkeys, each stuffed with herbs, garlic, and lemon, trussed neatly and slid into the double ovens that filled the kitchen with the scent of rosemary and butter. The ovens roared softly, like warm beasts awakening. On the long counter we peeled and mashed 60 pounds of potatoes, their steam clouding the windows. Someone whisked gravy in a giant copper pot, while a group of high school students tackled the green bean casseroles and cranberry relish, laughing every time something spilled. I heard someone say, "This feels like home," and I almost had to step away for a second. The cold storage room, which I had stocked weeks earlier, turned into a command center of generosity. Donations began arriving faster than I'd imagined. Crates of carrots, bags of onions, sacks of flour, and even extra turkeys from a nearby farm. The door swung open constantly as volunteers carried boxes in and out, stamping snow off their boots. The local bakery dropped off dozens of loaves of bread, still warm, and a truck driver from Billings arrived with a cooler full of fresh milk saying, "Figured someone might need it more than me this week." I stood there in the middle of it all, the chaos, the heat, the scent of cinnamon and roasted herbs, and realized how strange it felt to finally be part of a family, even if this one had been built entirely from strangers. By noon we had 40 pumpkin pies lined up along the counter like orange suns, their golden crusts flaking under the touch of air. In the corner, 2 volunteers simmered apple cider with cloves and cinnamon sticks, the aroma swirling through every doorway. The ranch, once quiet and solemn, had become alive, every room pulsing with motion and laughter. I made sure the kitchen stayed open to everyone. No doors closed, no curtains drawn. From the great hall you could see the volunteers cooking, their hands moving quickly, sleeves rolled up, faces flushed from the heat. I wanted it that way. I wanted everyone who came later to see the people who made the meal, to understand that the warmth on their plate came from hands and hearts, not charity. In the grand hall, I began setting up the dining space. The long oak table, sanded and polished, stretched across the room like a wooden river. It could seat 100, but I ordered 2 more tables to be brought in from the barn, forming one continuous stretch of connected surfaces. No separation, no smaller tables tucked away. I had learned enough from my own life to know how painful it felt to be placed somewhere else. Here, everyone would sit shoulder to shoulder. We laid out table runners made of burlap and dried maple leaves. Down the center, I arranged glass lanterns with flickering candles and small pumpkins donated by a nearby farm. The walls were draped with handmade garlands, red, amber, and gold leaves strung together with twine by children from the local school. Near the fireplace, I placed a large wooden board with the words, "What are you grateful for?" burned into its surface. I left a basket of paper slips and pencils beneath it so guests could write something, anything, and pin it up. On a smaller table near the entryway, I arranged gift boxes of wool socks, knitted hats, scarves, and gloves collected from neighbors. Each item was tied with a simple tag that read, "Take one. Winter's better when we're warm together." Next to the basket sat fuel cards, blankets, and a small jar labeled coffee fund for drivers. People kept adding to it, slipping bills inside quietly when they thought no one was looking. Music began to fill the hall. Eli, a local guitarist, had brought his fiddle-playing daughter. They tuned softly at first, then began playing an old country hymn that melted into something lighter, a melody that wrapped itself around the clinking dishes and low hum of conversation. The sound of the fiddle climbed and dipped, echoing like laughter carried by the wind. Children who had come with their parents from town sat on the rug near the fire, coloring maple leaves cut from paper, their crayons rolling across the floor. And then came the symbol that mattered most. Right beside the fireplace where the warmth reached everyone, I placed a single chair. It wasn't fancy, just an old wooden armchair I'd found in the barn, cleaned and sanded smooth. Across the back, I'd carved a phrase with my own hand. For the one who felt unseen. I didn't explain it to anyone, but the volunteers seemed to understand. They glanced at it, nodded quietly, and left it empty. It stood there as a reminder that there was always a place here for those who had none. As the day wore on, the ranch transformed into something almost cinematic. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and steady, blanketing the fence posts, the pine trees, and the long drive leading up to the porch. Inside, the fire blazed high, and every surface glowed with the amber of candlelight and roasting turkey. People moved around each other gracefully, carrying trays, pouring cider, adjusting decorations. The energy was contagious, a kind of quiet joy born from doing something good together. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The air was cold enough to sting, but I didn't mind. From the porch, I could see smoke curling from the chimneys, the windows glowing gold against the gray sky. The snow crunched under my boots as I looked out across the valley. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone on Thanksgiving. I felt grounded, tethered to something bigger than hurt. When I went back inside, Margaret was standing by the oven wiping her brow. "Everything's almost ready," she said. "You'd better change soon. You look like you've been running a marathon." I laughed. It feels like one. In truth, I didn't care about appearances. My hair smelled of butter and smoke, and my sleeves were dusted with flour. But I'd never felt more myself. Around me, voices overlapped, people calling out instructions, laughter breaking through like bursts of sunlight. A boy of maybe 8 years old came up to me, holding a tiny slip of paper. "Can I pin this?" he asked, pointing to the gratitude board. "Of course," I said, kneeling to help him. He stuck it near the top, smoothing the paper with his small hand. In shaky handwriting it read, "I'm thankful someone remembered me." I didn't say anything. I just smiled and stepped back, letting the warmth in my chest spread slowly outward until it almost hurt. By 5 p.m. the food was ready, the table set, and the hall filled with light. The guests hadn't even arrived yet, but the ranch already felt alive. A living, breathing heart beating against the cold of winter. I stood near the doorway, the smell of sage and roasted turkey thick in the air, and whispered softly to myself. They said Thanksgiving was full. I guess they were right. It's full, just not the way they meant it. The moment made me laugh quietly, but my throat tightened all the same. For years I had wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. But standing there, surrounded by the noise of preparation, I realized something else. I didn't need their gaze anymore. The love I had been searching for wasn't locked in some unreachable table in Portland. It was right here, in the steam of mashed potatoes, in the hum of volunteers laughing over spilled gravy, in the soft chords of a fiddle echoing under the rafters. And as I watched everyone moving, working, giving, I thought, this is what family is supposed to feel like. A full table. Finally, by 5:30, the first headlights began snaking up the long drive, golden beams slicing through the falling snow. I stood by the front door, heart pounding, hands still smelling of rosemary and flour. The sky had already turned indigo, the air crisp enough to make every exhale shimmer white. Behind me, the long oak table stretched across the grand hall like a river of light, candles flickering, dishes steaming, laughter already rising from the volunteers who were still adjusting chairs and pouring cider. And then the door opened. The first guest was an older man in a worn army jacket, his beard graying, his steps slow but steady. He hesitated in the doorway, stamping snow off his boots, his eyes wide as if he'd stepped into something sacred. "Am I in the right place?" he asked softly. "You are," I said. "Welcome home." He blinked fast, swallowed, then nodded. Behind him came more. A young mother clutching a toddler wrapped in a blanket, 2 nurses still in scrubs, a trucker with wind-burned cheeks, a couple in their 70s holding hands, and a group of ranch hands who looked like they hadn't had a home-cooked meal in weeks. They kept coming, dozens of faces, some smiling shyly, some unsure if they truly belonged here. And each one, as they crossed the threshold, seemed to shed something heavy. By 6, the hall was full. 200 people. The noise was gentle at first. The sound of coats being hung, chairs scraping, introductions murmured. And then it began to grow. A low hum of voices filled the space like warmth returning to a frozen house. The band in the corner struck the first note, the fiddle dancing softly above the crackle of the fire. I walked between the tables, greeting people, refilling drinks, making sure no plate stayed empty. Everywhere I looked, there were faces, some lined with age, some young and nervous, some brightened by sheer relief. The food vanished quickly, but it didn't matter. Every time a tray emptied, someone appeared with more. The veteran, the first man who'd walked in, sat near the center of the long table. His name was Frank, and he carried himself with that quiet dignity you see in people who've lived through too much. When I stopped by to check on him, he smiled faintly, his hands wrapped around a mug of cider. "You know," he said, his voice gravelly, "this is the first time in 10 years I've had Thanksgiving with anyone." The table fell quiet around him. The music softened. Forks paused midair. 10 years, I repeated. He nodded, looking down at his plate. "My wife passed in 2013. After that, the holidays, they just stopped meaning much. I used to buy a frozen dinner, heat it up, sit by the TV. But tonight," he stopped, clearing his throat. "Tonight, it feels like I got her back for a while." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then someone at the far end began to clap. Slow, deliberate, heartfelt. It spread like wildfire. Within moments, the entire hall erupted in applause. Frank tried to wave it off, his cheeks flushed, but he couldn't hide the tears that caught the candlelight. "Don't clap for me," he said with a watery smile. "Clap for her. She'd love this place." And just like that, the sound turned into laughter. The kind that fills a room with something more than noise. It felt like every scar in the air had softened. I stood there, frozen in the middle of it all, realizing that somewhere along the way, my ranch had become a living, breathing organism. Every voice, every face, every bite was proof that something broken could still feed joy. Someone started passing around slips of paper from the gratitude board, reading them aloud. "I'm thankful for second chances. I'm thankful someone noticed me. I'm thankful I'm not eating alone this year." Each one drew murmurs, nods, and even a few tears. I caught Margaret wiping her eyes with her apron, muttering, "Don't mind me. It's just the onions." But everyone knew it wasn't the onions. As the night went on, the musicians shifted to livelier tunes. "Take Me Home, Country Roads," followed by an old folk song about coming home for the holidays. People began to sing, hesitant at first, then louder, freer. A child climbed onto his chair and began clapping along. A nurse set down her plate to dance with a little girl in red mittens. 2 truck drivers tried harmonizing and failed so spectacularly that everyone burst out laughing. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't choreographed. But it was real. At one point I slipped outside for air. The sound of music and laughter spilled out into the frozen night, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat. From the porch I could see the glow of the windows warm against the snow. Inside, silhouettes moved, people hugging, eating, singing. For years I looked at houses like that and wondered what it felt like to belong inside. Now I knew. When I went back in, the hall had shifted again. Someone had pulled out their phone to take a group photo. The kind where everyone squeezes in awkwardly, some half laughing, others caught mid-bite. "Come on, everyone," Elena called. "Let's show the world what family looks like." I stood in the middle, surrounded by faces I didn't know, but somehow loved. As the camera clicked, someone shouted, "Wait, one more." Then another. Soon people were taking pictures of everything. The kids coloring by the fire, the veterans sharing pie, the long tables covered in empty plates and crumbs. Someone tagged the local church and the sheriff's office. Someone else tagged the radio station. And within hours, the images began to spread online. By midnight, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Facebook was exploding. Photos of the ranch glowed on timelines across Montana. The long tables under string lights, the banner that read, "Everyone has a seat." The chair by the fireplace with its hand-carved words, "For the one who felt unseen." Comments poured in by the hundreds. Faith in humanity restored. "Wish I'd been there. This is what Thanksgiving should be." One video, taken by a nurse, showed Frank raising his glass as everyone clapped around him. The caption read, "10 years alone, not tonight." That clip alone was shared thousands of times. Local news picked it up by morning. And while I should have felt overwhelmed, all I felt was stillness. The kind that comes when you finally exhale after holding your breath for years. Later that night, after the last guests left, and the volunteers began cleaning up, I found myself standing near the fireplace. The chair, the one carved with those words, sat empty, the firelight reflecting off its smooth arms. I walked over, rested my hand on the wood and whispered, "Looks like they found you." A soft voice spoke behind me. It was Pastor Ruth, the same woman who'd answered my call days earlier. Her white hair glowed gold in the firelight. Her eyes kind but sharp, the kind that saw through pretense straight to the soul. She placed a hand on my shoulder. "Amelia," she said quietly, "do you realize what you've done tonight?" I smiled faintly. "Just cooked a big meal." She shook her head. "No. You gave people something they forgot existed. You gave them a place to belong. You gave them a real Thanksgiving." Her voice softened. "Not everyone gets the chance to heal others while healing themselves. But you did." I couldn't speak. For years I dreamed of hearing words like that. Not from my mother, not from my father, but from someone who truly saw me. And now they had come, simple and unadorned, from the lips of a woman who barely knew me, but somehow understood everything. Pastor Ruth squeezed my shoulder once more before walking away. I stood there alone for a long time, watching the fire settle into embers. Behind me, laughter still lingered in the air, faint but real. The kind of sound that burrows deep into memory. The call of reckoning. I thought about my family. Then the text message, the maybe next year. I wondered if they were sitting around a polished table somewhere, smiling for photos that already felt empty. I wondered if they could hear what real warmth sounded like. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, my heart felt full. And for the first time in my life, I didn't envy anyone's seat. I had built my own and filled it with the world. By morning, the ranch was wrapped in the soft quiet that follows joy. The kind of silence that hums, not empties. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The long oak table was a battlefield of crumbs and candle wax, and the scent of sage, butter, and cinnamon still lingered in the air. Outside, the snow had deepened overnight, smoothing away all footprints from the night before, as if the valley itself wanted to keep the memory unspoiled. I sat by the window with a mug of coffee, still in the same flannel shirt from last night, watching the pale light spread across the horizon. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel at peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't need approval to exist. But it didn't last long. My phone started buzzing on the table. Once, twice, then again faster. A flood of notifications. At first, I thought it was more Facebook messages about the dinner. Another round of strangers thanking me for the photos or asking how to volunteer next year. But when I glanced at the caller ID, my chest tightened. Dad, Mom, Lena. One after another, their names flashing across the screen like alarms. I ignored the first few. Then a text came through. From Lena. The entire town is talking about your public stunt. Another followed from Mom. You've embarrassed us. Everyone thinks you're attacking the family. Even Pastor Ruth mentioned it during service. Then Lena again, sharp as a blade. Wow, couldn't just stay quiet, could you? You had to make it all about you as usual. I stared at the screen, the words swimming for a moment before settling into something strangely distant. It was almost funny. All those years I'd spent aching to be seen, and now that they finally noticed me, it was only because the whole world had. The phone rang again. Dad this time. I let it buzz once before answering, putting it on speaker as I set it on the table. His voice erupted immediately. Amelia, do you realize what you've done? You made us look ridiculous. Everyone in town saw those photos, the papers, the church page, the local radio. They think we kicked you out, that we abandoned our own daughter. I sipped my coffee and looked out the window, the snow drifting lazily across the valley. Didn't you? I said softly. There was a sharp inhale on the line. That's not fair, Mom's voice cut in. We only wanted a simple Thanksgiving, just immediate family. You know how complicated things get. I interrupted before she could finish. Immediate family? I repeated. You mean Lena, her husband, her friends, and your church group? That's not small. That's selective. Dad's tone hardened. You're twisting this. You always do. We were trying to avoid stress this year. We thought you were busy anyway. We didn't know you'd feed 200 strangers. No, I said. You didn't. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. I let it sit before I spoke again, my voice calm, level. You told me Thanksgiving was full, so I filled it. Mom's voice cracked, caught between guilt and irritation. You made it look like we're villains, Amelia. People think we're terrible parents. I smiled faintly, though no one could see it. Mom, I didn't say a word about you. Not one. People just saw kindness and drew their own comparisons. From the other end, Lena's voice suddenly broke through, sharp, defensive. This is pathetic, Amelia. You've always had to turn everything into a performance. A ranch? 100 people? Who does that? It's desperate. And tone deaf. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath me. No, Lena, I said evenly. It's Thanksgiving. You remember that holiday, right? The one about giving. Her scoff was audible. Don't play saint. You did this to show off, to make us look bad. Before I could reply, another voice joined the line, one I hadn't heard in years. Aunt June. Somehow she'd been looped into the call. Maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. Her tone was low but steady, each word landing with the kind of quiet force that makes everyone else stop talking. Enough, she said. You've spent years setting one child on a pedestal and pretending the other was fine being invisible. Now that the world finally saw her, you're angry because it wasn't on your terms. June, this isn't your place, Mom began. But Aunt June didn't let her finish. It became my place the moment you made the table smaller and smaller until half this family had nowhere to sit, she said. For years, I watched you tell Amelia to be grateful for scraps of attention, while you threw banquets in Lena's honor. And now she's built her own table, not just for herself, but for others, and you're upset because it makes your silence look loud. No one spoke. Even Lena, usually ready with a comeback, stayed quiet. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire in my stove. Aunt June continued, her voice softening but never losing its edge. Do you know what I saw when those photos came up on my feed? I saw light, warmth, laughter. I saw people who had nothing come alive again. And I thought, finally, someone in this family remembered what Thanksgiving is supposed to mean. Dad exhaled, his voice trembling with restrained anger. You don't understand the pressure we're under, June. People talk. They talked long before this, she said sharply. They talked when you forgot to invite your own mother last Christmas. They talked when Amelia graduated and you left early to catch Lena's award dinner. You've spent your life managing appearances while she's been building substance. And now that substance is shining brighter than your decorum, you can't stand it. Her words hung in the air like smoke. For once, I didn't feel like the one defending myself. I just sat there, letting her truth do what mine never could. Cut through the noise. Finally, I said quietly, Dad, Mom, you told me Thanksgiving was full, and it was. It's just that this year it was full of the right people. Dad tried to speak again, but his voice faltered. You made us look human, I offered. Flawed? Maybe that's what we needed. Another long silence. Then the line went dead. The aftermath and a new tradition. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, waiting for the familiar ache of guilt to settle in, that old instinct that used to make me apologize for existing. But it never came. Instead, I felt something close to peace. When I checked Facebook later that afternoon, the post had gone viral beyond anything I'd imagined. People were tagging the ranch in their stories, writing captions like, if your house doesn't have space, Montana does. Thanksgiving done right. Proof that family isn't blood, it's who shows up. Under one photo, someone had commented, her parents must be so proud. I didn't reply. Some stories didn't need correcting. The truth was already clear in the warmth of that one picture. The long table glowing in the firelight, the old veteran smiling, the carved chair by the hearth still empty, but never lonely. For once, I didn't need to explain myself. The world had already understood. The calls stopped after that night. No more angry messages. No more half-hearted explanations. Just silence, wide and clean like the snow that blanketed the valley the next morning. I let it stay that way. I had nothing left to defend. What was done had already spoken louder than any argument could. Within days, the aftermath of that dinner rippled far beyond Montana. My inbox filled with messages, hundreds of them. Truckers wrote to say they'd passed through the valley and never forgotten the smell of apple cider on the wind. Nurses sent photos of their teams wearing the scarves we'd handed out with captions like, "Best Thanksgiving ever." One message came from a small town in Wyoming. "You inspired us. We're doing our own open dinner next year." Even the local paper ran a headline that made me laugh out loud. When one door closed, she built a table. And then there were the gifts. Not the kind wrapped in bows, but gestures that carried weight. The Veterans Association called to ask if they could host next year's event. "We'll bring the grill trucks," the director said. "You bring that spirit of yours." A neighboring farm offered to donate a steer. Another promised fresh vegetables from their winter greenhouse. A group of students wrote that they wanted to volunteer every Thanksgiving break. It was as if that one night had unlocked something buried deep in people. The hunger to belong, to give, to be part of something good. I spent the following week cleaning up the ranch with the volunteers who still dropped by after work. The snow never let up, but no one complained. There was a strange joy in sweeping, mopping, stacking chairs, as if tidying up meant preserving the memory itself. Every time I picked up a candle or folded a linen, I could still hear the echoes. Laughter, clinking plates, the soft murmur of voices saying, "Thank you." But one evening, when the hall was finally quiet again, I sat at the head of the long oak table and realized something was still unfinished. Not anger, not anymore, just something left unsaid. A final thread hanging loose. I thought of my parents, of the years I'd spent shrinking at that kid's table, of the 1,000 unspoken words that had lived in my chest since I was 14. Maybe it was time to let them out. So the next weekend I sent a simple text. "Dinner, just us. Sunday, 6 p.m. No explanations, no expectations." When the doorbell rang that evening, I almost didn't open it. But I did. And there they were. Dad in his old wool coat. Mom clutching her purse like a shield. Their faces were careful, polite. I led them in without ceremony. No cameras, no volunteers, no long tables. Just the three of us at a small kitchen counter, 2 bowls of stew steaming in front of them. For a while no one spoke. The wind rattled against the windows, and the fire crackled softly in the stove. Finally I said, "I'm not mad anymore." I saw Mom's shoulders drop just slightly. "But I need you to understand what it felt like." They both looked at me unsure. I took a breath. "Every year there was a table," I began quietly. "And every year there was a seat that wasn't really mine. The folding chair, the plastic cup, the leftover pie. You never said it outright, but you made it clear who belonged and who was convenient. And every time you said, 'Maybe next year,' I believed you. Until I didn't." Dad's eyes stayed down on his spoon. "Amelia, no," I said softly. "You don't have to justify it. I just need you to hear it." There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of the fire. Finally Dad looked up. His voice was low, almost tired. Maybe I didn't see it. I thought keeping things easy meant keeping peace." Mom's voice followed, thin but trembling. "I thought you were okay. You always acted like you were." I nodded slowly. That was the problem. I learned early not to make noise, not to make space. So I built one instead. For a while none of us spoke. Then Mom reached out, her hand hovering for a second before resting over mine. "I'm sorry we missed it," she whispered. "All of it." I didn't cry. There wasn't any anger left to burn through. Just a quiet understanding. Imperfect, fragile, but real. We weren't fixing the past that night. We were acknowledging it. And maybe that was enough. When they left later, Mom lingered at the door, looking out over the snow-covered valley. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Peaceful." I smiled. "It's home." She nodded, her eyes glassy. "You made something good, Amelia." After they drove away, I stood for a long time, watching the taillights fade into the dark. The ranch fell silent again, but it wasn't the lonely kind of silence anymore. It was the kind that holds space like a deep breath before the next beginning. The following week, I hung a new sign over the barn door. "Thanksgiving at the ranch, open table." It wasn't just a one-time act anymore. It was a promise. Every year this place would open its doors to anyone who needed a seat, a meal, a reason to keep believing in warmth. Volunteers began messaging months in advance, asking for shifts. Local businesses pledged supplies. The sheriff's office offered to direct traffic for next year's crowd. What started as an act of quiet rebellion had turned into a tradition, one that belonged to everyone. And every year since, when the snow starts falling and the lights return to the valley, that same long oak table glows again with candlelight and laughter. People come from miles away. Veterans, nurses, truckers, families who can't quite make ends meet. Even neighbors who just want to share something true. No one asks who you are. No one cares who you're not. Everyone just sits down and eats. Sometimes I still get messages from strangers who saw those photos long ago. "You changed how I see Thanksgiving," they write. And every time I smile because the truth is simpler. They changed me. So if you're watching this wherever you are, tell me, what are you thankful for this year? And where are you watching from? And remember this. If the people you hoped would make room for you never did, it's okay. Build your own table. And leave the door open for those who truly see you.